Well, we're talking about listening to the rabbis. When must we listen to the rabbis? I want to start with a background point. I hope making this point is superfluous, but I fear that it isn't. What's the status of expert opinion? Anywhere, in any subject. Chinese history, the culinary arts, cosmology, the history of money, sailboating. What's the status of expert opinion? When you have to make a decision what to do about a subject, whose opinion should you follow? Is it right to follow expert opinion? Must you follow expert opinion? Maybe it's wrong to follow expert opinion. Now, I have a recommendation, which you're of course free to follow or reject, but I follow it, and that is, if the question is, what is it right to do? And the subtext is, what is it right for me to do? That question elicits all sorts of prejudices, especially if you're American. If you have the good fortune not to be American, then maybe you're a little better off. But if you're an American, the natural prejudice is, don't tell me what to do. Don't give me any rules or directions. I live my own life and make my own decisions, etc., etc. So as to avoid those prejudices, I recommend thinking about, what does somebody else owe you when he's responsible to you? That calls up a very different set of ideas. So let's see. Someone borrows your car. You allow him. You're going away to the Bahamas for a month, and you say, listen, here's my car. He says, thank you very much. You tell him, I want you to know that from time to time, the brakes get weak. If you have any symptoms, like they squeak, or when you put on the brakes, the car pulls to the left or the right, get them fixed. You say, right away, no problem. You go off for a month, you come back, and you find your car decoratively wrapped around a tree. And you ask your friend, what happened? He said, well, the brakes failed. And you say, the brakes failed? Didn't I tell you that could happen? Tell me something. Did they squeak? Did they pull to the left or the right? He said, yeah, as a matter of fact, they did. And you say, well, so what did you do? He said, well, I fixed them. You fixed them? I didn't know you were an auto mechanic. And he says, I'm not. So why did you fix them? It's because I live my own life. Nobody pushes me around. Nobody tells me what to do. I don't follow anybody else's orders. I'm an original. I'm independent. I'm free. I looked it up in the book and I fixed it myself. Only, I guess it didn't really get fixed, because then they slipped and your car got wrapped around the tree. Are you going to accept that explanation? Are you going to let him off the hook? Probably not. Probably you're going to say, listen, I lent you my car. I expect you to take good care of it. I warned you that the brakes could slip. You should have taken it to a certified auto repair provider and not done it on your own independently. Why? Because the responsible thing to do is to take it to an expert. Experts are available and you're responsible, then you take it to an expert. And the same thing is true with somebody babysits your children, or somebody rents your house, or anything in which somebody owes you responsible behavior. Your standards for responsibility are going to be to use an expert opinion. I'll give you another example. George is driving down the highway and he sees an accident. Now, this couldn't happen today because of weird changes in the law, but there was a time when people with medical abilities did stop to help people at accidents. I know that sounds strange to you, but you can read about it in history books. 20, 30 years ago, people used to do that out of the goodness of their hearts to try to help people. Today, they slap you with a liability suit and a malpractice suit, and it's better not to stop. But it didn't used to be that way. So George stops, and there's a serious accident. Now, George happens to be a third-year medical student. And George is in the middle of a course on accidental injury. And in the textbook it says, when you come across someone with an injury of this type, This and this is the procedure for addressing it. When George read that in the book, he didn't agree. He didn't agree. So he said to the professor, listen, I don't agree with what's written in the book, and here are my reasons. And the professor says, I hear your reasons, but here are the answers. And George doesn't accept it. So the professor says, look, let's write to the author of the book. Let's get top expert opinion on your reasons against his procedure. So they write, and George presents his reasons, and the expert writes back, and George doesn't accept it. Now, here he is on the highway with precisely that injury in front of him. Now there are two scenarios. One scenario is that George follows what's written in the book against his own better judgment, and the person who he treats ends up paralyzed. Second scenario, George follows what he believes personally to be right against the book, and the person ends up paralyzed. In which case does George have a better defense against having done something wrong? In which case does George have a better position, not only in legal terms, but in moral terms, in rational terms? There's a better defense if he says, listen, I did what I honestly and sincerely believe is correct. I followed my own best judgment. Or if he says, I didn't follow my own best judgment, I followed what's written in the book by one of the world's experts on accidental injury. Which defense do you think is a better defense? In logical terms, in rational terms, in moral terms? Isn't it obvious that when he defends himself by saying he followed a world's expert, it's a better defense than saying, I did what I honestly believed was right. I, as a third-year medical student, without any clinical practice, without having gone on to specialize. I think it's obvious that when you have a question that's where in a subject where there is expertise, that the rational, responsible thing to do is to follow the expertise. Now, if you're an American, then either now or later you'll be itching to ask a question. But isn't every expert fallible? Yes, every expert's fallible. Well, fallible means they make mistakes. Right, they all make mistakes. As a physician friend of mine told me, every surgeon has killed people. Every surgeon has killed people by making mistakes in surgery. Okay then, if they all make mistakes, if they're all fallible, and he says something I don't agree with, why shouldn't I follow what I believe to be correct? After all, he could be wrong. In this case, I think he's wrong. The answer is, the fact that he could be wrong doesn't certify my disagreeing with him. Because even if he could be wrong, it might be extremely unlikely that I will discover his mistake. Because he's an expert and I'm just a beginner. You're studying math. I know this sounds horrible, but I won't prolong it. Just for a short example. You're studying math. Now in math textbooks you have proofs. So you introduce a few axioms and then there's logic. Proof, step after step. You get to step 10, everything's great. Everything makes perfect sense. Step 11 comes out of the blue. Where did that come from? How's it related to the previous? I don't see any connection at all. Turn the book upside down, draw some diagrams. Just absolutely wild. It doesn't make any sense at all. Do you think I should call a press conference and announce that I found a mistake in the book? Probably not, because tomorrow, when we go back to class and I ask the math professor, how does step 11 follow? He'll give me an explanation and I'll come to see how step 11 really does follow. How do I know that? Because I've done this 20 times in the past. I've missed how it follows and the professor explains it. That's his job, to explain things like that. Now look, if you look on the front page of this math textbook, it says it's the 4th revised edition. Why do you think they keep revising it? Because there are mistakes in it. But it's very likely that I, as a student, am going to find a mistake written in a book written by a PhD who's got 20 years of publishing in the field. So there are mistakes. The fact that there are mistakes doesn't certify that I'm justified in disagreeing with what the expert says. What it certifies is if I master the field and feel differently from him, then I'm certified in maintaining his opinion because he might be wrong. Doesn't mean that a beginner is justified in disagreeing and taking issue. Now I know that it is an article of American moral constitution that everyone has a right to an opinion. But the opinion that I have a right to differs. I don't think everyone has a right to an opinion. I think you have to earn a right to an opinion. You don't get the right to opinion just because you can talk. To have a right to an opinion on a subject, you have to know something about the subject. You have to study something, read something about the subject. Let me give you a really gross example. Suppose somebody stops you on the street and says, I know you're a Nazi. You are a Nazi. You say, man, you landed from the moon. What are you talking about? I'm a Nazi? Why do you say that? You think you opened my Facebook account, or you found my secret emails? Or, well, what's leading you to say that? Just, I can tell by how you look. I can tell Nazis by how you look. I know you're a Nazi. Should you say, well, everybody has a right to an opinion? I don't think so. I don't think he has a right to an opinion like that. I'll give you another example. Somebody's talking about India, about the poor people in India and the politics of India and so forth and so on. And then a person listening says, what do you know? Have you ever been there? You say, no, I've been there. And I read, dare I say, CNN, Fox News. All right. And he says, I spent 2 years there. I spent 2 years there. I traveled the land up and down. I talked to people from all sectors of society. I had access to government. You think you know something about India? Let me tell you. Now, should I respond, well, I have a right to an opinion? I don't think so. He obviously knows much better than I do what's going on in India. He should inform me and I should change my opinion. It isn't a fact of birth that you have a right to an opinion. Right to opinion has to be earned. And a person should know his own limitations. I think this is true across the board. This is the council of rationality across the board. Questions up to here, because I'm going to build on this foundation. As I said, especially Americans find this very difficult to take, because it somehow squeezes their operating space. Okay, well, if you think of objections or problems as we go along, I'm happy to go back and work on this, because I think this is extremely important for all facets of life. All right, now, Judaism is a subject about which there's a vast literature. And not only a vast literature, but a technique of analyzing and understanding that literature, probing that literature, criticizing it, revising it. It's an intellectual discipline, like any other intellectual discipline. Learning how to interpret Mozart, or learning differential equations, or learning how to solve chemical formulas. It's a discipline, technical discipline, which takes the average person years to master. If you subscribe to Judaism as a system, if you want to know what does Judaism say about PQR, there are experts who are trained to analyze what the tradition says and give you an expert opinion. Seems to me the same logic that would require using an expert for auto repair or medicine or any other area of life would require it with respect to Jewish practice as well. About 15 years ago, I was ill. I was listening to the radio talk program here in Israel, interviewing somebody from a kibbutz in the south, associated with the Reform movement. The interviewer said, I understand you do have some form of keeping Shabbat. Yes. Suppose a question comes up about Shabbat observance. Can you use automatic sprinklers on Shabbat or something else? How do you decide it? What procedure do you use for deciding what's the right thing to do? And a member of the kibbutz said, we assign 2 or 3 people to review the Mishnah on that subject, and then they give us a report, and we usually follow what they recommend. Okay. Now, I would like to ask a question. I wasn't part of the discussion, but a question occurred to me. Suppose a question comes up about using a new type of fertilizer, or a new type of crop rotation, or a new type of insecticide, or switching to a new crop because of the economics in Europe and so on and so on. Would you do the same thing? Assign 2 or 3 kibbutz members to review the literature and give you an opinion? No, you would not. You would hire 1 or 2 professors from Tel Aviv University who are experts in this area, pay them good money to come down and give you an expert opinion. Why? Because fertilizer or insecticide or crop rotation means money. More or less money for the kibbutz, and that's important. Whereas Shabbat observance is a matter of a kind of club, and a cultural club, and if you do it this way, do it that way, it doesn't matter too much. I think that's right. That's right from where they stand. Their attachment to Reform Judaism is more or less a kind of ethical identification and club which is measured by the meaningfulness to the various members. Is this something objective and important like money? So why would you pay for a rabbi from Jerusalem to come down and give you an extra opinion? You don't care about it in that way. Whereas money you care about. I think their practice is perfectly reasonable for them, but it also implies that if your attitude towards religion is different from that, if you think that the tradition is something worth following in its own terms, in terms of what it really means, then expert opinion is absolutely necessary. And that means that whenever a question comes up about what the Jewish tradition says about a particular subject, the only place to go is to an expert, which means a rabbinical expert. Questions up to here. Okay, one very important reaction to these ideas is, well, sure, if the question happens to be a religious question, and I pledge allegiance to the system, then of course I want an expert opinion from the system. I recognize that expertise is the only responsible way to behave, and I understand it's a vast system, so of course you want an expert opinion. But what about all the areas of life that aren't religious questions? So there, according to what you've said, I should appeal to the experts in those areas. Marital policy, practice, strategy, marital problems, health, economics, where to live, how to spend my spare time. Yes, the question of Shabbat, I understand, religious question. Question of kashrut, I understand, religious question. Prayer and so forth and so on, I understand that. Holidays, those are religious questions. But a lot of life isn't religious questions. That's a drastic mistake. It's a drastic mistake for two reasons. First of all, every area of life has some Jewish rules that apply to it. So that at least some Jewish input is going to be required to have all the relevant expertise about that question. I'll give examples in a moment. And secondly, even if there aren't direct Jewish rules that apply, any decision you make in any area of life is going to have implications. It's going to have effects on the quality of your life, which will affect your ability to deal with Jewish projects, and therefore indirectly, expert opinion from the Jewish tradition is required to make that decision in a competent way. Let's start with the first example. Let's talk about job. Have a job. What's Jewish about having a job? Well, first of all, there is business law. Judaism has business law. And in some areas it's pretty strict, like fraud, false advertising, misleading statements, taking advantage of a customer's ignorance, or you're signing a contract in terms of cooperative venture, taking advantage of the other side's ignorance of certain legal aspects. Standards which are not adhered to in the general business practice. And that means that if you are a lawyer, for sure, and if you're an accountant, almost for sure, throughout your career, you're going to be asked to do things that are forbidden. Lawyers are asked to do this all the time. Put this clause in the contract. You and I know that there's an obscure law from Iowa in 1916 that this clause will refer to. The other side will never guess that it's a reference to that law. They don't know about that law, and we'll catch them. On the third year, we're going to double our profits, and they're going to lose out. Too bad. Can you do that as a lawyer? When you know you're taking advantage of the ignorance of the other side? Jewish terms, that's very, very problematic. An accountant will be told, okay, put the date on this particular sum this way so that it'll go on next year's taxes rather than this year's taxes. It's not the correct date. Yeah, but it'll save the company a lot of money. If you don't know the Jewish law about how you have to function in business, and you're not strong enough to live up to it, then you don't belong in that job. Jewishly, you don't belong in that job, because that job is going to compromise your Jewish morals. Can you find a job that won't compromise your Jewish morals? There may be less pressure. I don't think a dentist is under that kind of pressure. He doesn't have a whole corporate entity that depends upon him, that's pressuring him to do the wrong thing. Yes, there may be temptations to cheat on materials or some of the sort, but they're not nearly the kind of pressure that he'll come under as a lawyer or an accountant. And in whatever profession you engage, you you need to know what the Jewish rules are for that profession. Psychology. There are privacy laws in psychology. Are they acceptable in Jewish terms? Let's suppose somebody comes to you and wants to be treated for his guilt feelings about marital infidelity. He's cheating on his wife, but he doesn't want to feel guilty about it. He wants to make his peace with his infidelity. He wants to practice infidelity, feeling good about himself. He's hiring you as a psychologist. This is psychologist as hired gun. This is what I want. Psychologist, give it to me or I'm going to get somebody else. I'll pay you good, make me feel good. Should you do that? Is that the right thing to do? Are you allowed to do that? Rather than treating him in such a way that he'll have the strength to be faithful, to be moral, to be responsible. Can you answer that kind of appeal where your job is to confirm him in his corruption, to back him up in his corruption? Are you allowed to do that? It'd be very problematic in Jewish terms. Very problematic in Jewish terms. So again, the Torah has rules for what you can and cannot do, and that means your choice of profession and how you conduct yourself in your profession in Jewish terms is something for which you're going to have to appeal to the rabbis, because you can't practice without it. Now, it's true that in certain types of religious decisions, you need other experts to participate as well. Some decisions require cooperation. For example, can I fast on Yom Kippur? I have a medical condition, and fasting might affect my health. I go to the rabbi and I say, listen, I have this medical condition. Should I fast on Yom Kippur or should I not? The first thing the rabbi will tell me is, go to a doctor, person who knows the condition well, and tell him to give you a description. If you fast for 25 hours, no food and no drink, what will happen to you? And what are the probabilities? The rabbi doesn't know that, so you have to go to the doctor to get the medical facts. Then you go back to the rabbi and say, here are the medical facts. The rabbi says, well, if these are the risks, you can fast. If those are the risks, you can't fast. The bottom line decision is made by the rabbi, but he may need input from relevant other experts. That's often the case. So when I say that rabbis are always relevant, always applicable, I don't mean to cut out other experts. But the other experts provide facts. And the rabbi provides the values that determine what you should do, given that those are the facts. From our point of view, no other expert can provide values. The Torah is a complete system of values. And it's the rabbi alone who's an expert in knowing the values, but he may need these external facts. Now, that's one sort of consideration. The other sort of consideration is this. I have a friend who became a doctor, and for the first, 20, 25 years of his life, he worked in the emergency room. I asked him, why did you choose that? He said, because there's no continuing care. I'm in there 30 hours a week. When I walk out, I walk out. Person that I treat after the emergency is over is sent upstairs for continuing care to the various departments. I don't see him again. I haven't got any further responsibility for him. I don't take my work home with me. I'm not wondering, gee, I saw that x-ray, that. Should I consult with experts in Munich? Should I call my friend in London or not? Or maybe I can do it on the basis of Chicago. I don't have any of that. When I walk out of the hospital, I'm out. And I didn't want to take my work home with me. I felt it would affect my home life, family life, would affect my ability to be effective in my community. I didn't want that. I thought to myself, that's very important. Everybody knows there are some professions where a responsible person will take his work home with him. What will happen to his Shabbat? What will happen to his prayers? What will happen to learning with his children? He's learning with his child, he's looking at the text, he's trying to explain to the child, and his mind is on, what are they going to say in court? How will I answer that argument in court? Will he be there for his children? So the person knows that he's that kind of hypersensitive or hyper responsible about the responsibilities that he has, may say, I want to choose a profession which isn't going to interfere with me in that way. And that means his Jewish values have an effect on the kind of profession that he will pick. Similar to where do you live? Obviously, wherever you go, you need a Jewish community. No Jew can function on his own. But Jewish communities have different complexions. They have different sorts of services, different sorts of emphasis. People with a certain type Jewish needs will feel more at home in some cities than in others. So before you move to a city, you ask what kind of Jewish community is there, and in what ways can it serve my Jewish needs. What about getting married? My golly, what business does the rabbi have in telling you who you should marry and who you shouldn't marry? Having even an input, what does any of his business? The answer is that second to deciding to live a life of Torah at all, whom you marry will have a bigger effect on your Jewish performance over a lifetime than any other decision. Anything that will have an effect on how you live Judaism is something for which a rabbinic input is relevant. That being the case, you want to consult with the rabbi, and if you need expert opinion outside, the other person has certain types of experience, certain type of background, maybe let's say a trauma in childhood. Well, you need to go to a psychologist. I mean, assuming psychologists understood trauma, a lot of them don't, and a lot of them pretend to, and they don't really. I don't have much faith in psychology as a profession. But assuming they understood something about this particular case, so then you would want to have the psychological information, but then you would want to go to the rabbi and say, look, this is the psychological information, these are the probabilities. What do you think in terms of my Jewish practice is the best thing to do? So I think that the rabbis are relevant to every situation that one is faced with in life. It's not as if you could sequester religion off in some corner and say, these are religious activities, that's where the rabbis are relevant, elsewhere they're not relevant. They're relevant everywhere. Are we together? Okay, now what happens when the rabbis disagree? What about that? Don't they disagree very often? Well, we're not in a position to say very because we haven't got a quantity out of which we could take a percentage. But they do disagree. What happens when the rabbis disagree? Now, I'm going to answer this with a strategy which I recommend in general terms. If you want to know what it's responsible to do in Jewish terms, almost always your general moral judgment will be right. So translate the problem into a non-Jewish context where you feel more at home, you feel more confident of your judgment, and ask yourself what would be the responsible thing to do over there. And then you can almost always import it to the Jewish context. So let's see. Someone has a medical condition. You or a relative or somebody you're responsible for, you're going to go to an expert. What would you do if the experts disagree? What would you do? Say, what? Research it on your own? Give me a break. It'll take you 6 years. The person needs to be treated next month. Sort of do an internet search and see which of the two therapies is more popular? You might do that, although why would you trust the people who say it's more popular? Maybe they're telling you something that's not true. You don't know which sources to trust. Let's suppose they're reasonably similar. Lots of people believe that this is correct, a lot of people believe that is correct. And they're all experts. What would you do? Well, you'd pick one. And you'd do what that expert said. Suppose it came out badly, and you were accused. What would you say? I went to an expert. What do you want from me? Somebody said, why didn't you go to the other expert? I said, well, why should I? They're both experts. You have any reason to think that one's better than the other? I picked an expert and I followed what he said. What more could I have done? You did the best that you could do. The same is true in Jewish terms. If the experts disagree as to how to handle a situation, then you go to one of them and you pledge allegiance and say, listen, I'm under your care. Tell me what to do and you follow it. If you're challenged at any later date why you did what you did, you say, listen, I went to him. He's a world-recognized expert and he told me what to do. What else would you have had me do? What should I have done instead? Is there anything better I could have done? No? Then I have a perfectly justifiable position. There's nothing that I can be accused of failing in. Furthermore, if the question is a question of personal development or handling a certain personal problem and so forth and so on, sometimes you can have differences of approach which aren't contradictory. Let's imagine a case of sports. A person wants to train for a certain event. And he goes to a trainer, and the trainer says, here's the plan. It's a 10-step plan. First we emphasize the legs, then we emphasize the torso, then we emphasize the arms, then we emphasize balance, then we emphasize 2-part coordination, then 3-part coordination, then 4-part coordination, and then finally we get into the actual performance. You go to another one, he says, that's not the way to do it. Balance is crucial. Balance has to come first. The truth is, they might both be right. It might be that the first one's plan works well, and it might be that the second one's plan works well. There's no exclusivity here. The fact that different experts have different plans for development doesn't mean that one's right or one's wrong, or that both of them are wrong. It may be that they're both right. It may be that this expert has worked out this procedure for developing, and it works. He knows from experience that it works. And this expert has worked out a different procedure for developing, and he knows from experience that that one works. So the fact that there are different experts with different plans of development doesn't mean that either one is wrong. It may be that just that he has become an expert in using this plan, and the other one has become an expert in using that plan. At any rate, when the rabbis disagree, then the thing to do is to pick an expert rabbinic opinion and follow that. Now, there is a footnote here. There are people who say, oh, so that's the deal. The deal is to pick an expert. Well, I have access to general information. I can find out beforehand what various experts hold on various issues. And that being the case, I know how to get what I want. I'll just go to the expert whose opinion is the one that I'm in favor of. That way, I can do pretty well. Maybe I won't always get it, but I can gerrymander my questions in such a way as to get the outcomes that I favor. That's not appropriate. I can't say that it's strictly speaking wrong and illegal, but it's not appropriate. The reason it's not appropriate is this. Every part of Judaism is related to every other part. It's an integrated, organic system. When you will study Talmud, you'll find this out right away. On one page of Talmud, there can be 20 different subjects. They're all interrelated with one another. They all have effects on one another. When you're building a life of Jewish practice, a decision in one area is going to have an effect on how you operate in other areas. You want the decisions that you get to form a coherent, integrated whole. It's a little bit like this. In medicine, any serious issue goes to a specialist. What then is the purpose of the GP, the general practitioner? Just because he's cheaper and most of the things that you go for aren't important, so he can take care of them? No. The GP keeps track of all the experts you go to in all the issues that you have. He has a global picture of what's going on, and he may say, you're using that physical therapist and you're taking this drug for that other condition. It's not going to work because the maneuvers he puts you through are going to be made dangerous by that drug. And the physical therapist may not know that. And the GP who has a picture of your total situation, you yourself may not know that. You may not know to tell the physiotherapist that you're taking that drug. What's one thing got to do with the other? The answer is, it may make a gigantic difference. I had prostate symptoms about 10 years ago, and I went to a urologist, and he said, take alpha blockers. Took alpha blockers. My performance in exercise went down 25% right away. I said to him, could it be that the alpha blockers are affecting my physical capacity? Absolutely not. I asked another doctor, absolutely not. I have a friend who just knows a lot about a lot of things. I said, I was prescribed to take alpha blockers. He said, I'll bet your physical performance went down. I didn't have to tell him. I said, yeah, how did you know? I'm telling you, I know alpha blockers do it. I went off the alpha blockers, my physical performance went up right away, back to where it was, without any difficulty. Then I found another solution for the problem, and Baruch Hashem, I haven't taken alpha blockers. But this is what you need. Someone has to have a global picture of what you're doing so he can talk about the coherence of each of the details. That's why what we say is go to a particular rabbinic authority and use him for all your decisions, because he then can make sure that all the decisions have a coherency and an integration. Now, it's universal, I would say, that when you go to a particular rabbinic source and he represents a certain strand of expert opinion, he won't give you all your decisions. You may have a complicated question in a particular specialized area, and he'll send you to somebody to get a decision. But when you come back and you report the decision, that goes on your chart, so to speak. Okay, that's how you're dealing with this problem, with this particular practice, and this person can say, okay, how does that integrate with what he does on Shabbos, what he does for prayer, what he does with kashrus, what he does with business. Each one has to be integrated into a whole. By the way, this applies also to your style of Jewish practice. When I was becoming religious, I became finally convinced that the Torah is true and that I'm obligated to follow it. My attitude was this: the Torah is all the Word of God. The Talmud is all binding. The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, I pledge allegiance. But customs are just customs. And I said, thank God I wasn't born into a religious family. I could choose the customs that I like. I could choose the customs that express how I feel, that are reinforcing for me. It took me a few years to figure out that that's dumb. Okay, it takes me a while. I finally figured out that the fact that there are Jewish styles, a certain Sephardi style or certain Sephardi styles, and the Hungarian style, yeah, Hungarians have a style, and the German style, and the Polish style, and the Russian style, spiritual geniuses created these styles by amalgamating hundreds of different features in different ways to make an integrated whole. That requires genius. That requires genius. The likelihood that I have the genius to put together my own set, my own unique selection of customs into an integrated whole is zero. Then I realized my freedom is to choose among the established styles. Not as if I'm going to create a brand new style. Okay, so that's the idea of experts and when experts disagree. Now I want to inform you of something which people have as a kind of background belief, which is really paralyzing in this area, and it's very important to make sure that it's dealt with. You'll hear often that Jewish law is built on respect for the past. Always the past is superior to the present. The people were greater scholars, they were more righteous, they were more holy, and therefore Jewish law cannot challenge the past. The past is absolutely fixed. At most, what Jewish law can do is create a legal position on new realities. That it can do. But as far as the past is concerned, the past is absolutely fixed in stone. Nothing can be challenged or changed. That's simply not correct. It's simply not correct. In fact, with only one exception, every code of Jewish law, every composition of Jewish law was challenged and overturned by later authorities, with only one exception. For example, the Mishnah. The Mishnah. Later authorities in the Talmud, on a number of occasions, rejected the law in the Mishnah and decided the law against the Mishnah. The Mishnah is not binding. It is not binding. Maimonides' code. Maimonides' code is not binding. The Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, is not binding. The decisions of the Jerusalem Talmud are not binding. The decisions of Maimonides could be challenged and rejected today. I won't say this happens free-handedly, but there's no legal barrier. The Gaon of Vilna could take issue with the medieval authorities and did so without hesitation. I've seen others as well. Shagas Aryeh quotes the Tosfos and says, but it's not right, and he gives his own approach. The only exception is the Babylonian Talmud. When the Babylonian Talmud settles an issue, when it declares Hilchasa that this is the law, that can't be challenged. Now, why is that? This is the only example of a text, a decision that can't be challenged. So Maimonides, in his introduction to the Mishnah and his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, explains that the Babylonian Talmud has two unique factors, which together made it unchallengeable. One is that it was circulated to all the known Jewish communities at the time, and they all certified it, they all accepted it. And number two, the editors of the Babylonian Talmud, Ravina Rav Ashi, had a certain quality which he called Baalei HaToka. Literally, out of the dictionary, that means they were masters of copying accurately. Latik means to copy accurately. What that means exactly, I don't know. He doesn't explain it any more than that. But he says, because the Babylonian Talmud was accepted and ratified by all known Jewish communities, and the editors had this quality, and they were the ends. They were the last people to have this quality. That's why the Babylonian Talmud is binding. But nothing else is binding. Nothing else is binding. Now, if you tell this to people who know something, they'll say, oh, poor Gottlieb, he teaches Samech. What does he know? But everybody knows that the Amoraim, the later Talmudic sages, could not challenge the sum total of Tanoim, those are the sages up to and including the Mishnah. So there's another case where it's unchallengeable. But that's a mistake. That's a mistake. Because There are two explanations of the attitude of the Amoraim to the Tanoim, and both of them support what I'm telling you. In Hilchos Mamrim, the Kesef Mishnah discusses this, and he says, why is it that the Amoraim don't challenge the sum total of Tanoim? Because they decided not to. They decided that they weren't going to do that. They took it upon themselves not to do that, which means there's no legal barrier. There's no legal barrier. Nothing's stopping it. They decided not to do it. People could decide whatever they want, right? For whatever reasons they want, but they weren't required to do that. And when I said, by the way, that the later sages rejected the Mishnah, what they did was they said, the opinion of the Mishnah is really the opinion of so-and-so, but we have other Tannaitic opinions which disagree with him, and we side with those other Tannaitic opinions. So the Kesef Mishnah's explanation of the Amoraim not challenging the Tanoim is that they decided not to do, but there's no legal barrier. And then I found in Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, in his notes on Bava Basra, a passage in which he says, he had a problem with a certain Tosfos. He went to Reb Chaim Brisker, and he asked him about it. And Reb Chaim Brisker said, it's simply not true. An Amora can challenge a Tana against the Kesef Mishnah. An Amora can challenge a Tana. You find so often that an Amora takes a position and they quote a Tannaitic source and he's considered to be refuted, said Reb Chaim Brisker, that's because the assumption is that the Amora didn't know that Tannaitic source. There is no assumption that the Amoraim knew all the Tannaitic sources. Almost always it's assumed they knew all of the Mishnah, but all of the other Tannaitic material is not assumed. And the Gemara is assuming that the Amora took this position because he didn't know that Tannaitic source, and had he known it, he wouldn't have taken it. It's assuming that. But in a case where the Amora waves the flag and says, I know all the Tannaitic sources, and I disagree with all of them, he has every right to do so. Now, this reference in Rabbi Chanan's works is very obscure. I showed it to a couple of strong Talmudic scholars. First they faint. Then they take the book and turn it upside down. Maybe they're not reading it right. And then finally, after wriggling around and they can't get out of it, they say, well, we don't know what to say. No, we don't know what to say. Okay, fine. Could there be a mistake? Anything could be a mistake. But at least what you see is there's no legal barrier stopping Amoraim from fighting with Tanoim. There's no legal barrier. Either it's the Kesef Mishnah who says they decided not to, or it's this source from Reb Chaim Brisker which says they don't have such a barrier altogether. The only exception is the decisions that are made by the Talmud, when the Talmud says this is the law. Which means, if Jewish law doesn't change, it's not because it can't change. It's because those who are the greatest scholars and who know what's going on in the current circumstances have decided that it shouldn't change. There was a certain person who coined a very bitter, prejudiced motto: where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. It means the rabbis can do what they want. If they want to do it, then they can change it. They'll figure out a way to change it because it's infinitely flexible and it's just what the rabbis happen to prefer. That's absolutely incorrect. It's absolutely incorrect. They have a responsibility to be faithful to the law as the law. It's the will of God after all. But that means that where it's necessary, things definitely can be changed. Now, with certain restrictions, but there's no prohibition in general against changing things. And in terms of Jewish practice, this happens all the time. The 20th century saw a revolution in Jewish practice. That was the invention of school system for girls. Until the 20th century, from Moses, that's 3,200 years. 3,200 years, there were no schools for girls. By the way, for the first 1,500 years, there weren't schools for boys either, for the first 1,300 years. Schools is considered to be a failure. Not a success, but a failure. The first yeshivas were made for orphans. The Torah's prescription is that parents should teach children, not schools. Using schools is only second class. But if you have orphans who don't have parents, so then you have to have schools for them. So one of the Tanoim instituted schools. From that, schools became more and more popular for whatever reason. Schools didn't become popular for girls until the 20th century. Sarah Schneer campaigned by going to the top rabbinic leadership and convincing them that she was right. They agreed and they certified what she said, and that's how it came about. So the idea that Jewish law is stuck in the past and can't relate to modern realities is simply not correct. Another time I was sick in Israel, and I was listening to a talk program, and a woman called in and she said to the host The rabbis in this country are not doing their job. So the host said, why is that? And she said, because the rabbis were doing their job. They would figure out how we can go by bus to the beach on Shabbos. Their job is to figure out how we can do what we want. And if they aren't figuring it out, so then they're just vicious, or lazy or incompetent, because that's their job. The job is to figure out how to do what we want to do. We want to go to the beach by bus on Shabbos, so they should figure that out. That's certainly not correct. But as I say, if someone feels, how can I expect the rabbis to deal with my case, seeing that they're stuck in the past and they can't relate to present realities, that is simply incorrect. So, what we have is the necessity of appealing to rabbis. The last thing that I want to talk about is the different schools of Jewish practice. There really are different ways of putting the Torah into practice. They differ in priorities, in emphases. They differ in some specific legal decisions. If you are an Ashkenazi, I want you to know that if you eat regular Ashkenazi meat, your Sephardi friend cannot eat at your house. Because the Sephardi tradition on what is required for meat to be kosher is stricter than the Ashkenazi position. Sephardim are required to eat roughly what we call glatt kosher. For Ashkenazi, you don't have to eat glatt kosher. So, what then is the status of this difference? Does the Sephardi look at his Ashkenazi neighbor and say, you are going to hell because you're eating treif meat? No, he doesn't say that. What he says is, 800 years ago, there was a disagreement about how smooth the lungs have to be in the animal to make it kosher. And my tradition follows the strict opinion, and your tradition follows the lenient opinion. Both traditions are appropriate. Both opinions were authorized, certified opinions, and therefore we each recognize the validity of the other's practice. Of course, the Sephardi can't eat at my table unless I am eating glatt. He can't do that. But he doesn't condemn me for what I do. In this respect, I want to tell you something which, when I was on my way in, certain people used it to create a false conclusion. There's a difference of opinion between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about a certain issue. It's too complicated to discuss now. But according to Beis Shammai, according to Beis Hillel, if you follow Beis Shammai's practice, the children will be forbidden. The children will be mamzerim. That's pretty serious. But the Mishnah says, even so, the people who followed Beis Hillel and the people who followed Beis Shammai did not refrain from marrying each other's children. In comes the liberal Jew and says, see that? Sure, they disagreed about what children will be mamzerim, but that's only religion. That's only ritual. They were more understanding of one another. They understood the needs for peace and for harmony, and they said, okay, that's our ritual position, but don't let that not get in the way of social harmony and social integration, and they married each other's children in spite of that. That's what they say. Yeah, but the Talmud doesn't say that. The Talmud says, you know why they married each other? Because Beis Shammai informed Beis Hillel of the lineage of each of his children, and they said to Beis Hillel, according to your position, you can't marry these children. So Beis Hillel trusted Beis Shammai to inform them as to which children they could marry, so that they could be sure to marry only the ones that met their decision, their policy. And I tell you that that's real respect. You don't respect a person when you say, for the sake of peace between us, you should sacrifice your principles. That's not respect. That's just an appeal to violate his principles. The way you show respect for a person is to say, let's work out a way in which we can all cooperate and integrate with one another where everybody's principles are respected. Now we have to sacrifice your principles. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. That's what the Talmud is talking about. So, for example, the Hillel Foundation in the United States, which provides rabbis to many campuses in the United States, some of whom are Orthodox, when they have a convention over a weekend, the activities on Shabbos are all Shomer Shabbos. Why? Because non-Orthodox Jews don't have a principle of riding in cars on Shabbos. If I didn't ride in a car, I ruined my Shabbos. I didn't perform Shabbos the way my Judaism says so, I must ride in a car. There's no such principle. The food is kosher, or at least there's a kosher option, because if the food is all kosher, because it's cheaper that way than having two strands, A non-Orthodox Jew doesn't have a principle, I must eat pigs on all occasions, I must have cheeseburgers. He just doesn't care. So the way you achieve integration and harmony and cooperation is by respecting people's principles, not by requiring them to violate their principles. This is the way in which the Jewish tradition has always done it. And that's the way, I think it's the only reasonable way to do it. And anyway, bottom line here is that a rabbinic connection is important for all of life. And the final point I want to make is, it's not just a question of going to the rabbi, making an appointment, and getting an opinion. It really means creating a personal relationship with a rabbi who could apply the decision to your personal circumstances. Your personal circumstances are relevant. They're relevant to the decision. It's not just cut and dried law. There's a story of a woman who came to the rabbi on Friday morning with a chicken to ask him whether it was kosher or not. She came in with the chicken, she was holding it in her hand, and he was sitting there with his students, was giving a lecture. They said to her, okay, I'll get to you. Let me finish the lecture with the students. And she's sitting there. He's talking to the students. It's getting late. The market closes, let's say, at 12 o'clock, 10:30. She's thinking, if it's treif, I got to do something. What am I going to do? And he says, yeah, I know, I understand that, but, you have to wait. So it's 11:30 or whatever. And he looks at the chicken and he says, it's kosher. Well, she goes home. So the students say to the rabbi, what happened there? You never do that. She's in a hurry. It's Erev Shabbos. She's got to prepare. Why did you make her wait? He said, I tell you, when she walked in, I could see from a distance what was wrong with the chicken. And I know that there's a difference of opinion about this. And I also know that she's very poor. And to get a replacement chicken would be very, very difficult for her. She'd have to borrow money and it would be difficult and might cause tension at home. And I also know that this particular problem with the chicken is a matter of a controversy. And when it's hard to find a kosher one, you're allowed to use this one as kosher. But as long as it's reasonably easy, then you have to replace it. So I waited until it would become very hard. Then I could rule leniently and tell her that it was kosher for her. And it really is kosher. Under those conditions, it is kosher. But at 10 o'clock, it wasn't so hard. At 11:30, it was hard enough. And then I could rule leniently. That's the way Jewish law works. They say there are 4 sections to the Code of Jewish Law. There's a 5th section. The 5th section is straight thinking. It's not written anyplace. It's something you learn when you practice with an authority. And by the way, every Jewish authority has gone through active practice, apprenticeship. He watches an authority make decisions, and then he can ask him afterwards, why did you do it this way? Why didn't you do it that way? He has practical training in being a Jewish decider. You want a relationship with a rabbi where when you come, he can apply the law to your condition. Not just out of book learning, but also out of knowing you personally. That's how Jewish use of rabbis in deciding Jewish practice is done. Questions left over? No? Okay.